Welcome to Rewiring Legal, the series hosted by international law firm Bird & Bird, in which we explore how innovation and bold thinking are transforming legal operations and procurement. My name is Thomas Davies. I'm an associate in the corporate team here in Bird & Bird's London office. I advise clients on a range of corporate matters, including M&A and venture capital, and I work across many of the firm's key sectors, with a particular focus on the technology and communications space. Outside of my core practice, I work closely with colleagues across the firm to find, test, and champion legal tech solutions. I'm fascinated by how the legal industry is being reshaped by technology and how we as lawyers can help shape that transformation. In this episode, our guests will share their insights and predictions on the evolving legal tech landscape. We discuss what's driving current investment in legal technology, how pricing models are evolving to adapt to developments in AI, and how legal tech enhances rather than replaces human expertise. Whether you're a GC, a legal ops leader, or a tech provider, this conversation offers practical insights into a rapidly changing landscape. So without further ado, let's dive in. I'm delighted today to be joined by two fantastic guests to talk all things legal tech. Firstly, let me welcome Christine Kim from Greylock Partners. Christine, welcome to the podcast, and perhaps you could get us started today by telling us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here. My name is Christine Kim. I'm a partner at Greylock Partners, which is a venture capital firm based in San Francisco. We invest in early stage software and startups. We invest primarily at the seed and Series A stages. And really across all categories, the firm has a cyber practice and infrastructure practice. A lot of things are happening within AI for us, especially at the application layer. For myself, I focus mostly on vertical applications. That's our way of saying industry-specific applications. And so for us, big industries where we see a lot of potential for AI, like healthcare or like legal, as we're going to have a discussion around today, are the areas where I most focus on. Greylock is about a 10-person team on the investment team. And so each one of us is pretty generalist in what we see. So I'm coming into this conversation with a broad aperture of looking at a lot of domains and a lot of industries across AI, but particularly excited to have a conversation today about legal trends and everything we're seeing there.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for taking the time today. And we're also joined today by Henry Goodwin from Leo Capital. Henry, great to have you. And it's a welcome back from you, I think, because you actually started your career as a lawyer and spent some time here at Bird & Bird.
I did indeed, Tom. Yeah, that's right. A few happy years here with Bird & Bird in London, a few years ago now, and indeed began my career as a lawyer. Spent time here in the UK and over in Singapore as well before switching into venture capital. So I'm now a partner with a fund called Leo Capital, which is an early stage VC fund headquartered in Singapore and specializing again across a number of different industry verticals. But certainly legal tech is one of the key areas of interest for us and increasingly. So historically, we've done a lot in areas like fintech, digital health, cyber and DevOps. We recently launched our first fund in Europe last August, and we started making investments out of that fund. So a really great time to be looking at all the excitement going on in the legal sector.
Brilliant. Well, I can't think of better placed people to be talking all things legal tech. I think the legal tech market at the moment is pretty hot. I think it's fair to say. And there's headlines almost every other day about new products, new developments, new trends. So Henry, I'm going to put you on the spot and ask you to just give us a bit of an overview of what's going on in the market at the moment.
Sure, Tom. So clearly there's been an uptick in interest that's sort of tracked the uptick in deal flow and size of deals in the space. I think the figure for Q1 this year is getting on for 2 billion in terms of deal value. The deals these days, and it's not just true of legal tech, I think across different verticals as well, are slightly smaller in terms of the number of deals, but deal values continuing to increase. So I think that's very exciting in terms of the bigger picture and the attention that the sector is getting from the investors and seeing those subsequent rounds of funding coming through from, we focus primarily at the sort of pre-seed and seed stage, but going on to later to pre-series A. And of course, Christine and other funds picking up the late stage funding as well. Also interesting to see the globalization of that market. So again, we look to find founders anywhere in the world, but to help them to access the big markets in the US and the enterprise clients in the US. We're starting to see that migration of the successful companies into those markets as well, which is very exciting indeed. So an expanding market driven by AI, the funding rounds to reflect that as well. Certainly exciting times all around, yeah.
And Christine, Henry touched on it there about the US, but perhaps you could give us your perspective from across the pond.
Definitely. Yeah, I think we're seeing a lot of investment and a lot of interest in the US. And I think a lot of companies that are started in the US or building their headquarters here are really looking at the market globally. And so that's a trend that we see. And likewise, we're seeing startups that are started in the UK or started in Europe also looking at the market globally and trying to sell to large US law firms. So I will say it really does feel like a global stage and not something that is going to be fragmented too much at the regional or country level. Similar to Henry, I have just been watching the amount of funding going into this space. I mean, it's remarkable. Probably from, my vantage point, like I said, I'm looking at all different verticals here at Greylock. I'm looking at healthcare, construction, legal, financial services. We're interested in all of those, but it's just stunning to see the advancements and the success of companies specifically in the legal space. I think it speaks to why legal is a good use case for AI and why people see such an opportunity for AI to augment and really disrupt a lot of legal workflows. But yeah, I think just that's pretty incredible to see. In terms of some data that's really interesting, I think since 2024 to this year, over the last maybe over that 2-year window, or if a little broader, we see a little over 2 billion going into companies that we would tag as AI. It's also based on Crunchbase data. When you look at all of legal funding in general, about 80% of what we're seeing is AI. So obviously, I think you can't comment on legal trends and legal tech trends without also acknowledging that most of the interest is being driven by AI. And I also really feel like the modern era of AI and the opportunity set to invest in really kind of got started in 2023 and beyond. So I think it speaks to a lot of the activity now. I think some of these big numbers, like the 2 billion in funding, a lot of that is going to well-known startups that have raised a lot of capital by now. Clio raising almost in their last round nearly $1 billion, and I think their Series F, led by NEA. Harvey, which is a US-based company, hitting the 3 billion valuation. I know in Europe, there's a company called Logora, which you are all working with, that's making some great progress as well. And then some companies even outside of what I would consider classic law firm tech, which is technology selling to top-tier corporate law firms that are serving corporate clients. But we're seeing things in consumer law. We're seeing things in personal injury. There's a startup called Even Up and many other startups that are automating demand letter drafting, and that is in a consumer practice area, personal injury. There was another startup called JustPoint, which raised around 50 million to do something interesting in the mass tort space. So I do think we're starting to see a spread of the technology and the attention, even outside of the domain that's most relevant for Bird and Bird, and probably the first domain that we paid attention to, which is really the use case around corporate big law.
Fantastic. Thank you both so much for that. And yeah, there's so much cash flowing around in the market at the moment, and it's really exciting as a user of those products to see that innovation. And I think we do need to focus a little bit on what kinds of innovations there are in legal tech at the moment. We've talked quite a lot already about artificial intelligence, but is there anything else going on in the space at the moment, or is it all AI?
I think from the macro perspective, certainly AI has been the hot topic, really, as Christine says. The vast majority of opportunities now are leveraging AI in some way to transform the way that the efficiency of the way work is delivered internally, and also the effectiveness of the deliverables that are provided to clients in the legal context. So I think certainly that's been the predominant theme, and we're seeing all kinds of interesting areas now where previously SaaS solutions would have delivered value in a conventional context, but now we're seeing this interesting blurring of the lines between SaaS and services. So the market, as we perceive it, changes quite radically suddenly in an environment such as a law firm where you've got a lot of highly repetitive and quite costly tasks to execute. That's a whole new domain to look at disrupting, essentially. So that inevitably draws a huge amount of excitement into the space. It's not to say that there aren't non-AI opportunities out there. And of course, people are still building great solutions in more of the legacy spaces. But I think now this melding of domain expertise with very powerful automation is understandably a hot topic. And that shift from a more sort of generalist horizontal functionality to one that's much more vertically integrated. So the technology working with the experts in the building in a law firm to really transform how legal services are delivered is hugely exciting.
And Henry, maybe say a little bit more about the SaaS versus services trend that you're seeing play out, because we're seeing a version of that too. And I'm actually curious to hear a little bit more of your take, where maybe a previous company in this space would have looked more like a SaaS workflow or a system of record. And now there are more companies that are looking like services or even selling services. And so I'd be curious what you're seeing on that front particularly.
Yeah, so I think there's an interesting question here around, firstly, as I say, the blurring of that line where typically you'd have a large number of human components in the delivery workflow for a given area. So let's take litigation as an example. And I love talking about our own portfolio. So we've got a great company called Decover AI that's out of DC actually, but doing some great inroads into this market here as well. And I think there we're seeing how traditionally we've seen legacy systems and providers who've been able to help with e-discovery, for example, to help to extract huge amounts of data from underlying documentation. But the steps that are now being taken to then assess that data, to look for gaps in the data, look for inconsistencies and support the frontline troops, if you like, in terms of the lawyers servicing the case, is wildly different from what people would have expected in the past. So I think there's a big step there to doing the quote unquote thinking on behalf of those teams in a way that wasn't the case in the past. Now, of course, that brings in interesting questions, which I'm sure we'll come on to around the extent to which people might need to think again about the way that they work and how they resource deals in particular. But I think that's a big development in the space. And then a conversation we also get into quite a lot is around the need to give post-sale support in a sort of services way, almost, which I think is what you're driving at potentially, Christine, to really embed these solutions and make them successful, to give that support, not just in terms of sort of the engineering support, but also to help people to really utilize that and adopt it in the most meaningful way possible. That requires time and effort on behalf of the entrepreneurs and the founding teams. Arguably, that is a different model in terms of the scalability of that kind of solution. So it does bring those challenges. I think this is an interesting question for us as investors as to how we assess that in the future, and that sort of melding of the services, post-sale service element, which is pretty demanding at times, but the long-term value of that is certainly very exciting.
Yeah, definitely. And I think one piece in terms of the SaaS and services aspect that we've been seeing slightly different, but I would say like services for a long time in venture and in the startup world was a dirty word. You just didn't want to be considered services or perceived as services. It implies a different margin on the revenue. It implies something that might not even be recurring or sort of one-time or lumpy. So it's very different than what we're all used to, which is seat-based SaaS pricing that's recurring. But I think today it is really interesting to talk about services, particularly in the context of industries where there is not a ton of software, right? I think there is some software and there's a tech stack certainly that exists in legal, but it also looks a lot different than, okay, the horizontal stack that exists at some startup where they have every single productivity tool across every single department or function. It's a pretty mature stack, right? And so I think in these industries where historically penetration by SaaS or software has been more difficult, it is actually really interesting to think about taking a services-based approach to get something in the door today, especially if there is a vision to get some margin or automate it over time with AI or with technology. So we're a lot more accepting of something that looks like services in the Act 1 if there's an interesting technology or long-term vision in the Act 2, let's say. An example of this might be, hey, instead of building software around some document-based flow, and I'll be just very generic, where there's a kind of a word processor and you have a document and you might have AI that can help you draft a document. Maybe it's like a contract or any other sort of document, and delivering that software or interface inside your customer, the law firm, teaching them how to use this, as Henry points out, going through the post sales. There's a lot of change management. I think people do underestimate how hard it is to change behavior. I don't want to say that's a bad approach, but that could be one approach that would look more SaaS and software like. Another approach that would look more services like would be, hey, we know the customer wants X documents per week or on this turnaround timeframe. Can we just deliver the work or the documents or the services themselves? And over time, we're actually leveraging technology on our side as the service provider, or there's some way that we're thinking about, hey, over time, what does the software play even look like in the end customer? So it's a slightly different and nuanced way of thinking about building companies and products in this era. And I wouldn't say one is necessarily better than the other, but I definitely think today we're seeing more across both types, whereas, in yesterday's world, there would have been a pretty strict preference around just SaaS or just software tools.
That's really interesting from both of you there. And what's really interesting from my perspective as a practicing lawyer is just to hear how there's been this paradigm shift in legal tech where it's not just making us more efficient, but it's taking on some of the cognitive load. And it's a really interesting thing to sort of think about from my perspective, as I say, a practicing lawyer, because it just changes the way that we're providing legal services in quite a fundamental way. And that poses lots of challenges, both from a sort of regulatory perspective and also client communications perspective. I want to touch on what the barriers are to more widespread legal tech adoption in the industry. So I wonder, Henry, if you could talk a little bit around that.
Well, it's the lawyers, isn't it? Now, I think famously lawyers like to do things their way, and having had the joy of being on the other side myself and working in that environment, I think it's an extraordinary industry in terms of its success and the value that it creates, continues to create. But lawyers are very wedded to clients, of course, to their teams in terms of resourcing, to their know-how and their precedents, etc. And that has been working pretty well for decades and centuries. So to move into a new paradigm whereby technology comes into that equation with a view to helping improve outcomes is quite a journey for people, whatever form that technology takes. So I think at the end of the day, a lot of the new tools and the AI tools are data tools. That's not new. They're very sophisticated and increasingly powerful. But I think there's a piece there around people's mindsets around data, seeing it as an asset rather than a liability, and seeing it as something that can be mobilized and really extremely valuable for people over time. The use of data as well, not just client data, but internal data, things like resourcing, talent, and finding ways of getting the right people to do the right parts of the job as it goes through. So there's a piece there around data and lawyers' relationships with data that alone can help massively improve consistency and reduce the variability in terms of how matters are delivered and the profitability that's associated with that. So that's, I think, partly to do with the fact that there are generally not a lot of technologists in the building, as we were discussing not long ago. That is changing, but that will help, I think, to bridge the gap perhaps with other industries such as healthcare or financial services, where perhaps people are a little bit more open to it. Things like the open data, open banking in financial services, for example, has reflected the mood of the industry perhaps a bit more, whereas here it's still very much we're sitting on this valuable resource, but we're not quite sure about how to make the most of it. So I think over the next few years, I'm hoping we'll see that changing fairly rapidly. But the first step in doing that is really the mindsets, I think, and encouraging people to experiment and to understand a bit more about how that can really change outcomes in terms of internal efficiency and in terms of external effectiveness for clients as well.
Yeah, and again, from the practicing lawyer's perspective, I think there's this recognition, I think now, that there is this goldmine of unstructured data that all these firms are sitting on. And the question is, how do we access that? And Christine, I wonder if you've got any thoughts on that or other problems that might prevent the widespread adoption of legal tech, because of course you don't just work in legal. So maybe you could speak a little bit about that.
The top one that's top of mind for me, which is the data issue. So, I would say it's not so much about the nature of the data being unstructured or complex to work with. I actually think that precisely makes it an amazing data set for AI and large language models in a way that could have never been harnessed before. So to me, really the barrier is more of a philosophical shift of just how do we think about protecting this data, as well as just there's not a lot of precedent for how do firms that have this data. And in a way, I look at law firms as also guardians of data on behalf of their clients, right? And a lot of times there's this interesting relationship between the data that they have and then the clients they represent, the confidentiality around that, and what they even can share. And so sometimes I find it interesting to see you'll find law firms that are more progressive, but then they might be stuck where they feel like certain practice areas within the law firm can use the tools. Certain areas are still a little bit more landlocked until they figure out how to cross that bridge with their clients or help their clients understand what it's going to be used for. So it's really, to me, sort of a question around the governance, the philosophy, and the thinking about how to use this data rather than like any form that the data is in itself. And I actually think large language models are excellent at looking at unstructured data, looking at data that's inconsistent, that could be stored across many different types of file formats, really breaks the mold of SaaS applications that are all built on top of very clean, very structured databases. For the first time, you actually have technology that can really sift through all of this data. So I think the big question for me is, are we really harnessing it? I would say another way that I think about that is there's external data and there's internal data. And I think if you were to almost sum up what I'm seeing across different industries and what I'm seeing in AI overall, I think we've really had this moment where consumers and businesses overall have been really able to harness external data through tools, open and large tools like OpenAI or your big model providers that basically have the world's data like the way that Google harnessed at your fingertips. But I think what we don't quite have is, can I confidently look at all different industries and say, across these, all the tools are harnessing all the internal data to the fullest extent that they can? I think there are many applications that are making a dent and really doing really interesting things off of internal data. These are the data rooms that your clients have. These are all of the even internal policy information information, historical things that have been written inside the law firm for these models and these applications to learn what's the tone and the style of how, things should be worded and what should a document like this look like, because it's obviously going to vary from law firm to law firm. So I think, really just seeing the full harnessing of internal data, the way that I can say, hey, there's been this light bulb moment that everyone feels what that's been like with ChatGPT and external data. I don't think we're fully there. I have a lot of high hopes that we'll get there, but in my opinion, that's the biggest hurdle.
And as we're trying to overcome those hurdles, I wonder what are the sort of things that we can do to build and maintain trust in the legal tech that we're using, both, I suppose, internally with the lawyers that are using it in the law firms, in the legal teams within our clients as well, and then obviously between law firm and clients. What are those things that we can do? Is it governance? Is it communication? Is it training? Henry, I wonder if you can speak on that.
Sure. I don't think there's a single answer to this because it's a team effort. So I think communication is, as always, right at the heart of this. So I think I saw one of the Thomson Reuters recent reports was saying that 57% of the client base now expecting the law firms to be doing something in terms of AI. At the same time, they have very grave concerns and justifiable concerns around their use of data, as Christine was mentioning. So there's a bit of an interesting trade-off there. It's like, well, okay, so what would you like us to do demonstrably to deliver value for you whilst maintaining competitive pricing? So that brings in all kinds of interesting questions around business model innovation, actually, and how pricing might need to change. Dare I mention the billable hour? For that reason, I think it's an interesting challenge. But what should not be happening is a sort of vague promise of bringing AI into the equation vis-a-vis the client, and then a sort of dependent relationship developing between the individual lawyers and the law firm to then do something. And I think it's fine to think about tactical changes and testing of different pilots, technologies, etc. But you need to have a broader arrangement or understanding between the law firm and the individual lawyers within it around if you are prepared to embrace data, as we were just discussing, to test things out, be critical about how you're doing it, help us test what's, this jagged frontier in AI and where are the use cases actually that do work, just as you might with a new lawyer coming into the team. Now, they're not going to be perfect. They're really capable, super intelligent, and they're working 24/7 in this case, but they're not perfect out of the box. You need to really work with that. And the best people to do that are the individual lawyers. So the clients will add the pressure quite rightly because they're doing it themselves on their side. The law firm then needs to have the enabling environment to allow it to happen. But the stars of the show are the individual lawyers and the technology that they use. So I think calibrating that relationship, testing it, being prepared, dare I say it, to fail a bit and learn as you go, but communicate the whole time up and down that chain, I think is, for me, the secret there. So the more people you can bring on board that journey, the better.
Yeah, and again, from the sort of internal, in a law firm perspective, obviously been working very closely with Legora. We had a sort of 6-month trial phase that's now been rolled out to every single lawyer in the firm and non-lawyer, I think, as well. And the uptake rates are huge. As someone who is really heavily involved in that and, who's quite passionate about this stuff and who wants to see lawyers adopt more and more of it and use more and more of it in our practice, that's been really reassuring that there is this underlying appetite from our lawyers. And I can't speak for every firm out there, but if you read the headlines, you can believe that there is a huge appetite out there in the market.
What has been the key to that successful level of adoption? Because we hear lots of stories about very expensive licensing in of tech and very low adoption rates. So what do you think has been the key for Bird & Bird on that front?
Well, I think there's an ethos at Bird & Bird that we are a tech-focused law firm, and I think a lot of our lawyers are advising some of the most advanced companies out there who are developing artificial intelligence systems. After a short delay from ChatGPT being released to the public and everyone kind of using it in their daily lives to being able to use it in your practice with sort of client data in there where it's been permitted, the floodgates have opened, I think. The pent-up sort of demand was already there at a firm like Bird & Bird. But I think also the training sessions that we've been hosting with both internal and external speakers, I think that's really, really important because it gets people knowledgeable about what the tools can actually do, because it's not obvious when you first sort of open the box and go in and you're presented with this chat window and what do you actually do with the tool. So, showing the use cases, sharing all of that knowledge internally, that's been really important. And of course, that really close relationship with Legora, being able to work with them to develop the tools so that it feels like we're not just being sold as something that's out of the box, we can help develop it. And there's a nice story to be told there, I think, about that ongoing relationship and us feeling like and actually being part of the development of that tool. So there's a lot that goes into it. As you said, it's a multifaceted thing, but it's been a really exciting journey. Christine, I wonder if you had any thoughts on the sorts of things that we can do as lawyers and as legal tech providers to build and maintain trust in legal tech.
Yeah, I have a couple thoughts there. And I think similar to Henry, I think it's just a matter of the communication and the education to the client to understand how it's being used. I would take an optimistic view that if it's not today, at some point in the future and in the near future, clients are going to be educated on AI or using it themselves, especially for law firms that are serving more sophisticated or technology forward clients like yourself. And there will be the expectation of how are you using AI. And it's really just, I think, addressing it's not a black box that's helping us automate all these other things. I think just being open and frank about what it's doing. Like AI is helping us do drafting, or it's helping us pull information or do research. And why is that important? I think if it helps ultimately the lawyers serve their clients better by taking on a lot of low-level tasks, freeing up lawyers to actually have the bandwidth to think about the strategic pieces, to really be thinking about the highest, most complex aspects of a case or of a client's needs. I mean, ultimately, that's what a client wants, right? They don't want to just be paying lawyers all day to be sifting through, citing sources and kind of writing these long documents or contracts or kind of doing the drudgery, if you will, of legal work. And so I think if there's a clear understanding that that's what it's really being leveraged for, I think clients will really embrace it just as much as law firms are embracing it. So to me, it goes back to that communication and education piece. And I also think it's sort of this understanding, right? For me, when I think about this technology, I really think about it kind of automating the lowest hanging fruit, the most repetitive, the most well-defined, and, sort of the most safe tasks. It's not kind of coming up with, hey, what's the legal opinion or what's the final conclusion? We're still relying on humans to do that, and we should. No one's making an argument that there should be an AI lawyer doing everything, or in other industries, there should be an AI doctor that's prescribing you something. Maybe 100 years into the future, but I think we have a much more sober view around what the technology is doing. So I think when clients can have some reassurance and that's the model, there very much is a human along the way, that there's a human in the loop. We use that terminology to indicate that, for every step of the way, a human or a lawyer is checking the outputs of the model, checking the outputs of the application, is using it themselves to help them augment their own reasoning and their own tasks to ultimately give the clients better service. I think that paints just a much safer and a much more reassuring picture for clients. I think also going back to the data point, it's often not just a question of, hey, how are you using my data? But at the next level, is my data being used to train a large model somewhere? Is it leaking to help someone else get an edge against me? It's more for that. It's not so much, hey, Bird and Bird, I don't want you to use my data to get the best leverage out of that. So again, it's like, I think clients are somewhat sophisticated and fairly educated on AI. And if they're not today, they will be tomorrow very soon. And so it's just a matter of, I think, communicating to the most nuanced and most detailed level that you can around how it's being used, how the data is being used, how the application is being used. So clients just have that understanding.
Thanks, Christine. And I definitely agree that there's a real sort of client education point maybe that law firms need to go on to reassure that if we go into a conversation with a new legal tech vendor, data security, information security is pretty much, if not always, number one on our list. When you guys are speaking to your portfolio companies, I'm sure that's the feedback that you're getting as well. So I think there's that communication effort that needs to be doubled by law firms to make sure that we're putting that out there. We've talked a lot about the current state of legal tech, and I think there's always an eye to the future when we're talking about legal technology. So I wonder if, Christine, you could get your crystal ball out and give us an idea of what you think the legal tech industry is going to look like in the next sort of 3 to 5 years.
Great. Yeah, I have maybe 3 or 4 topics that I'll touch on, and because I think about this often. So first would be, and I'm not going to belabor it again, but the external data versus the internal data point. I think we will get to a point where we're really harnessing internal data and to the fullest extent, and I think that's when we're really going to see the biggest capabilities out of this technology. But in terms of some other themes that I'm excited about, one would be just paradigm of moving from Copilot to agentic. And again, I think we need to get clients excited about this. We need to get users ready for this new world. But really what this means is, in a Copilot world, you have an action where it's a little bit more push. Every single action is something that is initiated with a prompt or a question or a trigger by a user. So a user comes into an application and has a need. Copilot can help them get to that answer or help them create a first draft of something. What I like to think of Copilots as is a single turn action. So you need one thing. It can be fairly complex, but a Copilot can help you do that. It can be a question. It can be, hey, draft this thing, or hey, look at all these documents and summarize these. What's the point across these thousands of documents? So from fairly basic to fairly complex tasks. Moving along that spectrum, because I really see this as an evolution, if you will, from Copilot to agentic, I think when I think about agentic applications, what I'm talking about is taking on all those complex tasks and really chaining them. So you can have an application that can take care of multi-turn chained tasks, not just one task, but multiple tasks. And, the reasonable expectation might be it might take a day to do these tasks. It might take an hour to do these tasks. So again, now we're kind of disrupting the typical notion of how a consumer interacts with an application where they have a prompt or they have a trigger. They expect to get that back in real time. Now you might be in an agentic situation where you assign something over email or over Slack or whatever your communication interface is. That agent goes off and does a series of steps of work. And between those steps of work, there's also reasoning of, okay, first I did this. Now the next step should be, I need to go find this information. Now the next step should be, I need to contact this person because they have some information that I need for my process. You're almost describing actually the way that humans do work. And it's pretty amazing because I think we're starting to see some interesting applications that are agentic, that are maybe chaining 4 or 5 tasks together, each with a reasoning step in between. And, each of these tasks maybe take an hour to complete, or I would say each of these chains take an hour to complete. So I'm very excited to see what is going to truly be agentic in the legal context and help us move from that co-pilot world to that agentic paradigm. And I would say the last theme that I'm excited about is just thinking about new verticals that are adjacent or sisters to legal that can be great application areas for AI that we haven't really quite seen the same moment of excitement around that we have seen in AI, just touching on the amount of funding, the amount of startups that are building in legal AI today. But I would love to see more companies going after compliance or regulatory, or even, I think there's elements within transactional law specifically, right? Like terms and understanding what the more of the financial or the numeric or quantitative pieces that go into the transactional side of legal practices. Even thinking about, hey, what are the workflows across professional services broadly? When you think about financial, when you think about accounting, which also has a billable hour model, are there things that are going to work for those firms, either from an internal or operational perspective that also can be applied to the legal context? I think legal was first out of the gate in this arena of all these industries that I just named, but I'm excited to see some of these other industries also uptake AI and also see how that cross-pollinates or helps the use of AI in the legal sector.
The reasoning capabilities of the latest models to me are really, really impressive. And I think when I'm asking it to reason through legal problems, as of course that's our bread and butter, I'm always impressed with just how accurate it is. And it's sort of following the flow that any lawyer should be doing because it's applying logic to a set of facts with a set of rules. And so that's always impressive. Henry, is Christine right? Are we all going to be managing agents in the next 5 years?
I'd love to make the podcast hugely more exciting by saying, no, she's absolutely wrong on all fronts. But no, I absolutely feel a lot to be excited about for the reasons that Christine's mentioned, looking at how you're going to see the melding together of different workflows, this concept of vertical integration and sort of joining up the component parts. That requires a little bit of sort of blowing it apart to start with. And I think lawyers sometimes don't take a step back and, speaking from personal experience as well, and really think about what are you doing in terms of the component elements of this. And it's surprising how many of those aren't actually what you might call law or legal work. They're still hugely valuable because they're process driven and often highly commercial and strategic and risk adjusted for clients, but they're not necessarily in the conventional sense legal work. So that's a brave move that people need to make, the sort of comfort blanket around, the end-to-end process, and say, well, some of that stuff is actually a bit dull. I was trapped in data rooms for weeks on end back in the day. And some might argue that's good for, retention of information and doing the hard yards. And it's true that there are valid concerns around how the use of LLMs may make it harder for people to go on that career development journey. So I think there's a valid question around that. But really, if you take that step back and say, how do we re-bolt this together with these amazing agentic solutions to sort of supercharge your day-to-day, as you've been saying, working on the legal reasoning front, that's hugely exciting. So that requires some interesting, exciting effort to think about what does that actually mean, not just about the tech stack, but the talent stack that sits alongside it and the actual go-to-market and the business model. How do we think about pricing differently? If we've really thought about how much it costs us, we really understand the cost of delivery, suddenly we can be more brave with fixed pricing, not scared about doing write-offs at the end of each matter where we've overrun. We can be much more transparent with the client in terms of our model and indeed the tech that has helped deliver it. That's, I think, a major change for the industry, and at the risk of a bit of cannibalization over time, I think there's plenty of green space for people to occupy that domain expertise, the creative judgment that lawyers bring to the equation. There'll be more space for that and less space for some of the less exciting elements of the day job.
Yeah, we hosted an event a short while ago now with Legora and with From Counsel to launch their partnership. And Andrew Thornton, I think, said on the panel that the last sort of 20 years may turn out to have been one of the worst times to have been a lawyer, because in the future, to Christine's point and to Henry, what you just touched on, we may actually take a lot of the drudgery out of that work. So as a practicing corporate lawyer, I'm very much up for that. That's been fantastic. So thank you both very much for your time. Any final thoughts before we leave, Christine?
That statement is so powerful, right? To think about the pace of how things are growing and the kind of innovation that we can expect to see, not just in the next 20 years, but even sooner, in the next 2, in the next 5 years, because just the slope of these things is stunning. So I think it's such a powerful statement to end on. I couldn't agree more. And yeah, this has been a lovely conversation. So thank you all for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us. And Henry, I'll give the last word to you.
Well, I think it's a new era for law and for lawyers. That creative, critical thinking is a superpower that lawyers will continue to have and will continue to be valued. So get stuck in, folks.
That's it for this episode of Rewiring Legal. We hope you found the discussion valuable, and please do keep an eye out for the next episode in our series, where we'll continue the discussion on how legal operations and procurement are being transformed by innovation and bold thinking.